Welcome back to the Explainer. So, today we're going to dive right into one of the most fundamental, yet honestly profoundly important tools in environmental science. We're talking about the checklist method. Now, if you're looking to really understand exactly how professionals guarantee that massive, complex projects don't just completely devastate local ecosystems, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to strip away all the heavy jargon, look directly at the real data, and by the end of this masterclass, you'll know exactly how to read, build, and even actively critique these crucial frameworks. Let's just jump right in. Okay, here's our agenda for today's analysis. We're going to hit the impact analysis context, defining the checklist, the four types of checklists, reading matrices, critical evaluation, and then wrap it all up with a summary and review. Section 1. Impact analysis context, where checklists fit in. Before we put the checklist method under the microscope, we really need to understand the neighborhood it lives in, right? When professionals approach a huge new project, they absolutely don't just guess at the environmental impacts. They rely on a very specific toolkit. So when we talk about impact analysis as a whole, we're generally looking at three core methodologies. You've got checklists, matrix methods, and overlay analysis. Today, we're zooming in entirely on that first one, checklists. But definitely keep in mind, this is just one single pillar of a much larger analytical framework. In fact, checklists are very often the foundation that those more complex matrix or spatial overlay analyses are actually built upon. Moving on to Section 2, defining the checklist, beyond the simple to-do list. Now, when you hear the word checklist, your brain probably immediately jumps to, a grocery list or your daily task list. Go ahead and throw that idea right out the window. In this context, it's so much more than that. The checklist method involves highly standardized lists of the specific types of impacts associated with a particular project. But look closely at that phrasing. It's formalized to ensure that absolutely no potential impact is overlooked. Historically, sure, teams might have just sat around brainstorming in an ad hoc sort of way. But the modern checklist transforms that loose brainstorming into a rigorous, formalized organizational safeguard. It literally supplies strict instructions for how to identify and evaluate variables, forcing the analyst to systematically consider everything, from air quality to local fisheries. Section 3. The four types of checklists, an evolution of complexity. So checklists are definitely not a monolith. They actually exist on this fascinating spectrum of sophistication. In environmental impact analysis, there are four general types, and they represent a clear step-by-step progression in complexity. We start at the absolute baseline with the simple checklist, move up to the descriptive checklist, advance again to the scaling checklist, and finally arrive at the most complex form of all, the scaling weighting checklist. Let's break down exactly what happens as we level up through these steps. Let's compare the first two. A simple checklist is exactly what it sounds like. It's really just a raw list of environmental parameters. The big problem here? It offers absolutely zero guidelines on how those parameters should actually be measured or interpreted. It essentially just points and says, hey, look at the water. The descriptive checklist completely fixes this. It identifies those exact same environmental parameters, sure, but then it adds vital step-by-step guidelines on how to actually measure the data for that specific parameter. It tells you exactly how to look at the water. It basically turns a static, boring list into an actionable scientific instruction manual. Okay, now things get really interesting. A scaling checklist takes everything from that descriptive list, but introduces a totally new element, subjective scaling. It gives the analyst instructions on how to rank or scale the actual severity of a parameter. So, is the impact on air quality a 2 out of 10, or is it a massive 8 out of 10? Finally, the scaling weighting checklist takes this one massive step further. Not only are you scaling the impact of each individual parameter, but you're also subjectively evaluating that parameter against all the other parameters on the list. It forces the analyst to make a hard choice. Is a severe impact on terrestrial wildlife more or less important than a moderate impact on local agriculture? This right here is exactly where raw data meets complex human decision-making. Which brings us to Section 4, reading impact matrices, translating data into insight. Very often, these advanced checklists take the visual form of a matrix. Let's actually practice reading one together. This incredibly efficient structure communicates complex timeframes basically instantly. On the left side, we've got our environmental items, air quality, navigation, and agriculture. Now, just scan across the rows with me. For air quality, we see an X marked strictly under adverse short-term. But for navigation, the potential adverse impact is flagged as long-term. Meanwhile, check out agriculture. It actually shows a beneficial short-term impact from the proposed project. In literally seconds, a decision maker understands not just what will be impacted, but exactly how and for how long. Here's another highly effective matrix design, and this one brilliantly illustrates the cause and effect relationship between specific project activities and environmental components. Across the top, we have project actions: plant construction, farming, and transport. And down the side are environmental components. Trace the row for terrestrial wildlife. The X there tells us that the threat comes explicitly from plant construction, not the farming or the transport. For air quality, the primary driver is the transport of raw materials. This is huge because it allows project managers to pinpoint exactly which phase of their operation requires the absolute heaviest environmental mitigation.
Section 5, Critical Evaluation, Advantages and Disadvantages.
Now, as focus learners, we always need to maintain an objective academic perspective. No analytical tool is perfect, right? So let's look at the advantages first. The checklist method is remarkably simple to understand and implement. Honestly, this is its greatest superpower. It takes incredibly dense, specialized scientific information and perfectly summarizes it, making it entirely accessible to a mayor, a city council member, or a corporate executive who might have very limited technical knowledge. Furthermore, scaling checklists provide a really rapid, preliminary level of analysis. If you're choosing between multiple locations for a massive new facility, a checklist is just an excellent top-tier tool for initial site selection and setting immediate priorities. But of course, the limitations are pretty significant. First off, traditional checklists often completely fail to distinguish between a direct impact and an indirect, cascading impact on an ecosystem. Second, and this is a major critique from the scientific community, unless it's modified into a highly specific matrix, a standard checklist doesn't explicitly link a specific action to its resulting impact. It just kind of tells you an impact exists somewhere. Practically speaking, they can also become wildly cumbersome. If you have an immense number of categories to review, decision makers can get totally distracted from the most significant impacts, just lost in a sea of data points. And finally, the ultimate weakness. Especially in scaling and weighting, the identification and ranking of effects remains fundamentally qualitative and subjective. At the end of the day, it still relies on flawed human judgment. Section 6. Summary and Review. The Future of Impact Analysis. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. If you take away absolutely nothing else from this explainer, please remember these 4 key points. Checklists are essential, formalized tools designed for comprehensive data organization. They evolve from simple parameter lists all the way up to complex, weighted systems. They brilliantly democratize dense scientific data for non-technical decision makers, serving as the perfect preliminary analysis tool. But we must never forget their primary limitation. Their heavy reliance on qualitative, subjective scaling leaves them super vulnerable to human bias and overwhelming data volume. And honestly, that limitation leads me to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you with today. If the absolute peak of the checklist method, the scaling weighting checklist, still relies so heavily on subjective human evaluation, how can we leverage modern technology? How can we use objective, real-time data tracking and advanced computational modeling to finally remove human bias from the equation in future environmental impact assessments? Just think about that the next time you analyze a major infrastructure proposal. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.